Last Wednesday, President Trump declared a national emergency in response to the large and persistent trade deficit that has built up in recent years. This deficit is driven in part by non-reciprocal tariffs, trading barriers, and other economic policies pursued by our foreign trading partners. The situation is urgent. President Trump imposed tariffs to address this emergency, and these measures are aimed squarely at achieving reciprocity and reducing our massive trade deficit to reshore production in the United States. This national emergency declaration and tariff action is the most significant change in U.S. trade policy since we allowed China to join the World Trade Organization. The American working class, in particular, has suffered concentrated losses from the so-called China shock and other adverse effects of past trade policy and the conditions that give rise to this massive trade deficit. You've heard some of these numbers before. The United States has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and 90,000 factories since 1994. President Biden left with a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods, the largest of any country in the history of the world. The United States' share of world manufacturing output declined from 2001 to last year. In the fourth quarter of 2024, U.S. manufacturing as a share of gross domestic product was the lowest it had been in 20 years. During COVID, we were unable to procure semiconductors to build our cars or materials for pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment. During World War II, we built nearly 9,000 ships. Last year, the United States built only 3 ocean-going vessels. Our agricultural trade balance, which historically resulted in trade surpluses for our farmers, was in deficit the last 2 years of the Biden administration and likely will take some time to recover. These are all serious indicators of an economic and national security emergency, and we can't ignore it. One important driver of these negative trends has been unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal trade. This includes the effect of higher tariffs imposed by other countries on the United States, the effect of non-tariff measures that promote other countries' exports and obstruct U.S. exports, and other foreign economic policies favoring overproduction and degrading America's manufacturing capacity. And the lack of reciprocity is an important driver of our global trade deficit and with particular countries. So it's common sense to focus on these indicators. For example, the European Union can sell us all the shellfish they want, but the EU bans shellfish from 48 states. The result is a trade deficit in shellfish with the EU. We only charge a 2.5% tariff on ethanol, but Brazil charges us an 18% tariff. The result? We have a large trade deficit in ethanol with Brazil. Our average tariff on agricultural goods is 5%, but India's average tariff is 39%. You understand the trend here. Our trade deficit, driven by these non-reciprocal conditions, is a manifestation of the loss of the nation's ability to make, to grow, to build. And the president recognizes the urgency of the moment. On the first day of his second term, President Trump issued a comprehensive memorandum setting out his trade policy directive. And over the past 10 weeks, he has executed on nearly all of these priorities. He has tightened tariffs on steel and aluminum. He's imposed new measures on auto and auto parts not made in the United States. And on April 2nd, the president declared the national emergency that we've discussed. And so the president has imposed a reciprocal tariff along with a global baseline tariff to achieve reciprocity with other countries and to drive the dangerous deficit down. And the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Over the past few weeks, a planned layoff for an auto production shift in Tennessee has been suspended. Another automaker is hiring additional employees and expanding overtime to increase auto production in Indiana. Companies have announced $4 trillion in new investment in the United States. Nearly 50 countries have approached me personally to discuss the president's new policy and explore how to achieve reciprocity, and they've spoken with many members of the administration. Several of these countries, such as Argentina, Vietnam, India, and Israel, have suggested that they will reduce their tariffs and non-tariff barriers in line with the president's policy. And these obviously are welcome moves. Our large and persistent trade deficit has been over 30 years in the making, and it will not be resolved overnight, but all of this is in the right direction, particularly as we start to negotiate with these countries. We must move away from an economy that's based solely on government spending and the financial sector, and we must become an economy based on producing real goods and services that provide jobs for working class and middle class Americans in their communities. This adjustment may be challenging at times, and in a moment of drastic overdue change, I'm confident, I'm certain that the American people can rise to the challenge as they've done before. I appreciate this committee's interest in President Trump's trade agenda. I'm glad we're talking about this. That's created debate. And we may not agree on everything, but I know that you want to do what's best for America. So does the president, and so do I, and we'll collaborate together on this. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
At page 4 of your testimony, Mr. Greer, you said the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Well, I can tell you for a lot of Oregonians who have 401ks that are being drained out, that's pretty rotten stuff. And you ought to realize how serious this is for the country. Now, everybody in the administration practically has a different story about the Trump tax hike. So I'm interested in knowing what the story is today. Will higher tariffs go into effect tomorrow as announced?
Senator, yes, they're scheduled to go into effect. We are having negotiations with all kinds of countries at this time. The president's fixed in his purpose. The nature of the emergency that I discussed earlier is not something we can wait on anymore. So we will have the president's plan go into effect, and we're coupling that with immediate negotiations with our partners as they seek to.
So it's not a question of something being scheduled. You're committing this morning that they're going to go into effect.
This is what the president has said, Senator.
For how many countries? I understand it's over 50.
That are negotiating with us. We have about 50 that have come to speak with us, and I'm constantly talking to my counterparts. I have staff right now at USTR meeting with others, and we will have the tariffs in place, and if the other countries can come to an agreement on reciprocal trade, then that's something that the president can consider. I don't want to prejudge the negotiations or the president's decision, but that's what we're doing.
Now, you've said you've been negotiating deals. Foreign countries have already retaliated against our farmers and ranchers and small businesses. How can you commit that negotiations are not just going to stop bleeding, but are actually going to open up markets that the Trump tariffs have closed off?
So, Senator, we've already had many countries, many of our markets, explain that they are not going to retaliate against the United States. And in fact, Vietnam, for example, they've lowered their tariffs already on cherries. They've lowered them on almonds and apples, things I know are important to the Pacific Northwest. And this is exactly the right direction that we want to go in. I look forward to hearing from you what other kind of market access you want as we enter into these negotiations.
What's the status of China? As you know, that's a big market for us in the Pacific Northwest. What's the status of discussions there? I don't see much progress. What I see is it looks like it's going to escalate and escalate some more and hurt our consumers and our small businesses in our part of the world.
Well, Senator, unfortunately, China for many years seems to be choosing its own path on market access. Again, they have agency in this. They elected to announce retaliation. Other countries did not. Other countries signaled that they'd like to find a path forward on reciprocity. China has not said that, and we will see where that goes. I think we need to work with our closest friends to make sure that we have trading arrangements that work, and if the Chinese are open, we'll see what. But they haven't signaled that at all, so I don't think that's in the very near term with China.
I just am concerned that there's no strategy at all. I'm committed. We understand in the Pacific Northwest what the stakes are. To have a smart, tough strategy, I don't see any strategy at all, and you really haven't said much about what the strategy is this morning.
Senator, I appreciate your concern. I want to keep having a conversation with you about this, but I see a distinct difference between those countries who have come to us and they said, we understand your issues, we understand the deficit, we understand your desire for reciprocity, and we want to work with you on this. And the Chinese approach, which has been, we're going to retaliate. We're trying to remedy a situation. We're trying to remedy a situation that's persisted for many years. And it would be wonderful if the Chinese agreed with that and wanted to persist in, work with us on that. But that's not where they are. And the president has recognized this, and he wants to focus on other partners.
Let's talk before my time is up about services. The United States is a services powerhouse, from travel and technology to finance and media. Our services industry account for nearly 80% of the U.S. GDP and 8 out of 10 American jobs. Other countries are responding to Trump's global tariffs by retaliating against American services. Can you explain how your tariff actions aren't putting our services exports at risk like so much of your trade policy?
Senator, and Chairman Crapo mentioned this, we had India already pull down a digital advertising tax that affected some of our most competitive tech companies. We're already in conversations with other countries that if they want to have reciprocal trade with us, that's something that we need to consider as well. And we expect them not to discriminate against our services companies. We have some of the most competitive in the world, I agree with you. And to me, that's part of this calculation.
I wrapped up with the services question because it seems to me it's classic Donald Trump. Really good at talking about problems, even saying that there is some reason to go forward, identifying a problem. but pretty damn bad at fixing them. And there's going to be a whole lot of collateral damage in the process if you all continue with these trade policies in services and in other areas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship of the tariffs that you have put on and rising prices for the American people? What is it the American people should expect to be able to suffer as a result in terms of rising prices? I understand your position is that the long-term gain is worth the short-term pain, but what is that short-term pain going to look like?
So, Senator, I think we can look at, I think we should look at history and data for this. It's hard to project what's going to happen with prices, but we know in the first Trump term, the president imposed historic tariffs on China on an enormous amount of goods coming from China. And during that time, inflation went down by 0.1%. During the Biden administration, the historic inflation was not on imported goods or related to tariffs that President Biden put in place. It was related to, frankly, services, healthcare, education, et cetera. So I think there's not really a one-to-one on tariffs and price effects, and so many things go into price. I know you think I'm probably like dodging and weaving on this, but I'm looking at data, sir,
yeah,
and the data shows it's not one-to-one.
I know you're smart enough to know that the likelihood is that prices are going to go up for the American people as a result of the tariffs that you put in place. Do you disagree with that?
Oh,
I mean, when you say that the American, in your testimony, that you expect the American people will bear the burden, or that, and I'm sure they will bear any burden on some level. But what do you think that burden is actually going to look like?
Well, I think the challenges, frankly, are going to be more for companies that are largely dependent on imports from China and Asia, where they have to adjust their supply chains in a quick set of time. Yeah. And the way the tariffs get allocated between the foreign, the foreign producer and the importer, that's where the majority of adjustment
comes. And we have a bunch
of
those companies in Colorado, and I know that Osprey Packs, for example, they probably don't want me to mention them, but I will. And in Southwest Colorado would be a very good example of that. I mean, they are very dependent on the supply chain from Vietnam, and they probably are really worried today about what's going to happen, which a lot of people are. I mean, I think one of the things about the situation we find ourselves in is the degree to which we've now created huge uncertainty in our economy, and I'm worried that that is going to result in a lack of investment, capital investment. You mentioned some new investments that have been made in our economy, but I think that anybody who knows anything about the economy knows that uncertainty results in people freezing up, a paralysis, a lack of investment, which is going to make it hard for our economy and may actually provoke a recession. Could you comment on your concerns about that and how you're thinking about that? And I have one more question before I'm out of time.
So Senator, the best way to have certainty is to build in the United States, right? That's the best way to have certainty.
But that's going to take a long, long time. And what's going to happen in the meantime, do you think? So,
Senator, we have, I would say, dilly-dallied for years on this issue. We've done these broad studies, which are interesting and helpful that we saw come out of the Biden administration. Right. But we have to act. I can't sit for 3 years and try to fine-tune something.
I hear you say that. But you could have made a different choice, which was to strategically target a geography, which is strategically target Beijing, strategically target certain industries where, all industries in America weren't affected at the same time. You didn't make that choice. I mean, you're in the midst of having trade negotiations with 90 different countries at the same time, by your own testimony, all of whom can make their assessment, I assume, these are sophisticated people, about where the pressure points are on you, where the pressure points are going to come for us to not necessarily get the best deal because we're spread all over the globe negotiating every one of these agreements at the same time, rather than a more strategic approach, which would have had the benefit of giving us, I think, a much greater degree of certainty about where we were headed. Obviously, you made a different choice, and I'm just curious about how you think about your responsibility. How you think about that.
So I would note, and I think it's thoughtful to think about things in this way. If you look at the results of the reciprocal tariff, the Western Hemisphere generally is at the lowest tariff rate. If you look at where we have our largest problems with non-reciprocity and deficit countries, it's mostly in Asia. And so you do actually see pretty strategic outcome with respect to promoting production in the Western Hemisphere as opposed to where we have all this overproduction in Asia that's given rise to our current problems on trade.
I would just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, that's true. What the ambassador said is true, but it still doesn't, I still cannot fathom why we are treating Canada and Mexico, our largest trading partners, basically the same way we're treating Beijing. It doesn't make any sense to me. It makes no sense that we would do it all at the same time like that. And we're going to have to stay on it, which is why some of us have introduced legislation to make sure that Congress begins to take its appropriate role again in making these very important trade decisions. Thank you for your testimony.
The goal of this is to do more trade internationally, that the United States would be able to manufacture here or produce here and sell more internationally, and that we would have that opportunity to have increased market access. Is that correct?
So, Senator, I think that's accurate, because when we're trying to get down a deficit and have more production here, necessarily part of it is making sure we're not getting too many imports that are driven by unfair trade practices, but also promoting our exports overseas.
So then right now there's a lot of negotiations going on. There was a lot of questions for several days whether we're negotiating or not negotiating. I'm hearing from you pretty clearly today we are open to negotiate. We're trying to be able to establish better trade agreements to be able to move forward. Do you have any timeline on certain countries or places that you have set internally to say we hope to have negotiations complete by this point? Obviously, negotiations can extend as long as they have to, but is there a timeline you're dealing with?
So the president has indicated that he's willing to negotiate with parties that want to pursue reciprocal trade with the United States. We don't have any particular timeline set on that because, as you pointed out, Senator, the outcome is more important than setting something artificially for us. What I can say is I'm moving as quickly as possible, and a lot of these countries are moving very quickly, and we're working on the weekends, we're working at night as folks want to engage on this. Now, I will say, I know you want to ask something, the trade deficit has been decades in the making, and it's not going to be solved overnight.
Right. Yeah, everyone understands that well, and everyone that I talk to is grateful that we're actually attacking the trade deficit issue and try to be able to bring down barriers to trade. They also want to get a timeline. Let me give you, for instance, I've got an Oklahoma company that several years ago spent millions of dollars to be able to move out of China. They moved into Vietnam for production because literally what they're producing, the parts were not created in America. So they were looking for other places to go. They spent all the money, spent all the time, shifted out of China, got to Vietnam, and established there. Now they're saying we've got giant costs in Vietnam at this point. So they're going to have to renegotiate with every single retailer that they sell to, which is going to take a lot of time to be able to do it. What they're trying to be able to figure out is, do we hold on those negotiations and try to renegotiate with Walmart and Target and Costco and everybody else they're going to have to renegotiate with? Or do they press on with those negotiations now? If things are going to get resolved soon, they can pause. If they're not going to get resolved, they're going to have to renegotiate every contract again to try to figure out which way to go. So the time piece does matter to them.
Senator, I understand completely, and Vietnam is one of those countries that understands that it is, frankly, one of the major targets of this action, because their trade surplus with us is so lopsided. I think it's every $15 they export to us, we send them $1, and they remain closed to our exports where we can be competitive, agriculture, et cetera. But they've come to the table with an offer, right? We didn't go out and say, please come talk to us. They beat down our door and they want to talk about it.
I don't anticipate that we're ever going to have equal trade with Vietnam. We're a much larger economy than they are, but bringing down the trade barriers would be helpful so that they would accept American products to be sold there. I think that's beneficial, but most countries in the world are never going to buy as much as we're purchasing because we just purchase a lot more from there. Another issue has come up about garment manufacturing. Obviously, this is a challenge. We'll have different pieces that are bought from different countries. We don't have a lot of garment manufacturing here in the United States. For those garment manufacturers that are here and for others, some in Oklahoma, they're asking me about exclusions and exceptions and how this is going to be handled to say, we can't buy it in America. This is the only place that's actually manufacturing it. I know long-term, the hope is to be able to have a more diversified, but in the short term, they don't have another option. How do you plan to handle that?
Senator, the president has been clear with me and with others that he does not intend to have exclusions and exemptions, especially given the nature of the action. If you have Swiss cheese in the action, it can undermine the overall point, which is to get rid of the deficit, achieve reciprocity. To my point earlier to Mr. Bennett, the Western Hemisphere countries have a much lower tariff than many of the Asian countries, and I've heard from textile manufacturers for many years that they would love to have a situation where Western Hemisphere textile and garment manufacturing is more competitive, and maybe we're setting up the conditions for that.
So in the short term, there's no exemptions that are coming on it. So for companies that are currently buying from Asia at this point, whether it be for textiles, whatever it may be, the goal is to be able to push them out of Asia into the Western Hemisphere, or where do they need to go at this point?
Well, the president has been clear, again, that he's not doing exemptions or exceptions in the near term. My own sense is, given the tariff differentials between Asia and Western Hemisphere, I think people can start making decisions based on that.
You pretty well successfully deflected all of Senator Bennett's questions about what the immediate impact looks like in the short-term pain for the long-term gain. I just want to flag for you one issue that is very important to me. Rhode Island is a small business state, right? We don't have a whole lot of big mega corporations there who can balance things and move things around. Canada is our largest trading partner. We have companies who fill an important niche in the global supply chain, and particularly in American companies' supply chains, because they get something from Canada, or let's say China, could be, but Canada's our major trading partner, and they process that thing, and then they put it into the supply chain for the larger corporate entities. That's their business. That's all they've got. So if we're not looking out for these small businesses that are actually going to have to lock their doors and close the shutters and fire their employees and go out of business, I think you've missed a huge hole in the problem that these tariffs have created. If all you're listening to is the big mega corporations who can move things around the world and have the resources to dodge these effects, you're not getting the straight story. I think in every one of our states, there are going to be small businesses that occupy a niche in which trade is an important factor and that are going to go bust because of these tariffs. And I urge you to look out for those businesses, because I don't think they're getting their voices heard at all.
So, Senator, I've talked to you about this. I've talked to Senator Hassan about this and others. One thing I asked my team to do last week was to convene a meeting of I have a trade advisory council for small business. I've asked them to convene that meeting. I've connected with the Small Business Administration. They have an international trade desk there. I have an office that also deals with small business, because I do want to hear it. I think it's important that we hear it, because they don't have the same voices in Washington. I will say right now, Canada and Mexico, things coming from Canada and Mexico that comply with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement come in duty-free. They continue to do so if they follow the rules. If they don't follow the rules and are trying to put in Chinese stuff, that's going to be tariffed. But if they follow the rules, they're going to be getting the duty-free treatment they're due.
Well, a small business that has gone broke is not very amenable to a meeting. They don't exist any longer.
President Trump's tariffs have made almost everything that families buy more expensive. The president imposed a 10% national sales tax on all imports into our country, and an even higher sales tax on imports from more than 50 countries, including our allies like Canada. This is the largest tax increase in over half a century, and it's going to cost the average American family $3,800 a year. Their morning cup of coffee will cost more, so will new shoes for their kids, and so will fresh fruit. So my question to you, Ambassador, is how much revenue from the president's national sales tax will be used to give tax breaks to billionaires?
So, Senator, as you know, any kind of tariff revenue that comes in to the United States government, it goes to the Treasury, and Congress will decide what happens to that money. Obviously, the president wants to have a very competitive tax policy that's good for everybody. That was part of why he had such a successful economy in the first term, is he married trade action with good tax policy to have $7,000 an increase in real wages over that time.
Well, let's be really clear. The president, besides the contradictions in the way he talks about the purpose of his tariffs, the president's made very clear that he sees tariffs as a way of increasing increasing revenue. At the same time, he's working with the majority in Congress to give additional tax breaks to the wealthiest people in the country at the expense of working people who are going to be paying more for everyday goods they absolutely have to pay, goods they were hoping were going to cost less, given the president's campaign promises. But of course, he isn't keeping to those campaign promises as prices continue to go up. Now, the president's national sales tax is increasing prices for families. It's also causing huge losses in Americans' retirement savings. Ambassador Greer, would the administration reverse course if the president's tariffs led to 10% inflation?
Senator, the president is fixed in his purpose. This trade deficit and the offshoring and loss of manufacturing jobs is something that's persisted for too long, and it's dangerous.
I understand your justification for the policy, even though there are some very contradictory justifications coming out of the administration. But my question is, what's the inflation rate where you guys would reverse course? 10% inflation that I just asked you about, that is higher inflation than we saw at the peak of the COVID economic crisis. But you aren't going to say here today that you would reverse course even if you created inflation as high as we had at the peak of the COVID economic crisis.
I think the most serious inflation we saw was during the Biden administration. When we did tariffs in the first term, inflation went down. I just don't. It's not going to be a one-to-one. Inflation about how much money you're putting into the supply.
Well, let's just be really clear that the Trump administration is here today to say that even if inflation hits Americans' pocketbooks at 10% because of these tariffs, then the Trump administration is still going to go charging ahead. So, Ambassador, would the administration reverse course if the president's tariffs caused a 50% stock market crash, which would hurt Americans' retirement savings even more than they've been hurt in the last 10 days or so?
Senator, the fundamentals of the economy are so strong. We had 228,000 jobs last month. We have 9,000 additional manufacturing jobs from the month before.
Your answer is even if the stock market crashes 50%, which is how much the stock market crashed in the Great Recession, you're not going to say here today that you would reverse course even if you crash the stock market and harm retirement savings as drastically as happened during the Great Recession in 2007.
Senator, your hypotheticals are not consistent with the history we have seen with the use of tariffs.
My hypotheticals are based on the fact that a lot of Americans are looking at their 401ks today and wondering how much of a lifestyle change they are going to have, or whether they're going to be able to retire when they plan to, because of the recklessness and haphazard nature of the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs. Nothing was thought out about this. This has been a haphazard, incompetent effort, and it's showing.
When I speak to my rice people and my shrimp people back home, they say that the tariff barriers and the subsidies by other countries for those products are so much that it is putting some of our shrimpers and some of our rice people either out of business or in incredible financial binds. And so the fact that the president is attempting to address these as well as the non-tariff trade barriers is incredibly important. Let me first say that. But I also hear from my producers that the mean tariff being selected to apply to a country may not account that for rice, for example, the tariff is much higher for that particular product, and that it is not adequate to address that which is taking place. Any thoughts on that, and how can we have something more particular for products which are really over tariffed?
Yes, thank you, and I appreciate that concern, and the tariff rate applied to many of these countries again was a countrywide rate. It wasn't product specific. My sense is if countries come to us and they expect to have some kind of a different plan, they will need to change these things, right? And they will have specific products, specific barriers that they would have to address. Right, or else, the president, again, he's fixed his purpose. He wants to see production back here. He wants to see our agriculture producers doing well. And these countries just have to have reciprocal trade with us. And that means taking care of the types of barriers and tariff rates you're talking about.
So it sounds like you, one of the things I think they want to know is that since shrimp might be a relatively small part of trades with some of these countries, that the interests of, for example, shrimp will not be sacrificed in part of a greater whole.
No, I think, and I saw a really interesting article today in the New York Times on shrimp. You may have seen that, where the tariffs have actually given a bit of a lifeline to these shrimpers. And I think that, you know, if there's going to be any kind of change to any of this, and I'm not going to prejudge that, we have to make sure that our industries are protected adequately, so we don't go backwards with the deficit.
In the medium to the long term, do you plan to turn these tariffs into trade deals to reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers? I support that. On the other hand, if the purpose is to stall on negotiations in order to keep tariffs high for the sole purpose of feeding the U.S. Treasury, I oppose that. So is this administration for trade reciprocity or for Treasury replenishment?
Senator, thank you, and thank you for your years of service on the trade space, and you're one of the deans in this area. It's important to understand the sense of the emergency that we're facing and urgency with the need to reshore and do manufacturing here. It's incredibly important to the president. Yesterday, he stated very clearly that he is happy to engage in negotiations immediately with countries that believe that they can help us reduce our deficit and get rid of the non-tariff barriers and the tariffs that affect that. I think the answer, Senator, is it's going to be country by country. There are going to be some countries where they're not able to address their non-tariff barriers or their tariffs or the deficit fully, and there will be others who I think will be able to do that, and where the president will have the option of making a deal with them. So we're certainly seeking reciprocity. Now, if we have the tariff on a country, there's obviously going to be a revenue effect, but we need to reshore manufacturing. We need to get rid of our agricultural deficit, and we need to make sure that if countries are going to trade with us, it has to be on a reciprocal basis.
I just don't get it. You know, the fact on semiconductors, while you gave a small exemption, you didn't exempt GPUs, you didn't exempt lithography equipment, you put a huge hit on Taiwan, where we need collaboration with the TSMC. I'm baffled. I mean, you're gonna hear from me what I'm sure you're hearing from most of us, incredulous about, I think, probably the worst economic policies that I've seen in my lifetime. You know, and the data reflects that. You know, a global tariff of 10 to 50%, on almost every worldwide country. Although, I will note from my Republican colleagues, you'll be probably glad to know that Russia didn't get a tariff increase. Yeah, I believe that when all these global tariffs go into effect, I think most of them as of midnight tonight, tariff rate will be approximately 23%, highest since 1909. I believe that'll translate into the largest tax increase since 1968. We've seen the numbers of about $4,000 per family cost. Since Inauguration Day, more than $11 trillion has vanished from the market, and I will acknowledge that we got a little blip today, but I just talked to one of the senior folks in Wall Street, and he described today's market as a good day in hospice. I wouldn't use his name because, you know, there are no good days in hospice, but that's kind of how I feel. And again, I know you guys are supposed to know more than all of Wall Street, but you know, when every firm says, you know, we're going to see increased chance of recession, you know, and I've met you, Ambassador Greer. You know, I think you're a smart guy, but I don't think just because this is the way Donald Trump wants the world to be for the last 40 years that he can simply will it into happening. In my state, the Port of Virginia accounts for $124 billion in trade. That amounts to about 500,000 jobs. Those are all up for grabs now. We got 800,000 small businesses in Virginia. These tariffs are going to wallop them. I had last week a guy in from a local brewery in Alexandria. The owner's name is Bill. He's got a triple whammy. He gets his Pilsner from Canada. He gets his bottle caps from Mexico. He gets his kegs from Germany. So already, even in advance of these all kicking in at midnight tonight, he's laid off 10% of his staff. Even if the president flips on all this, he's not bringing folks back. I mean, candidly, I had another guy in from who makes bourbon and sells a lot to Canada. He thinks it'll be a cold day in hell before the Canadians start buying American bourbon again, simply because our trust relationship has been broken. So I guess the first question I want to give, I'm trying to figure out what would be a question that maybe folks haven't asked. Let me ask you on this one. Australia is one of our strongest allies. We have the AUKUS relationship, which is key to their national security. It's key to our industrial base, so we can continue to build subs. Terribly important. Interesting thing with Australia is we have a free trade agreement with Australia. We don't have tariffs. We even have one of the few industrial countries, we have a trade surplus with Australia. So Ambassador Greer, can you explain to me how it helps America's national security or our trading balance when we have, and I loved your fancy Greek formula, which was basically bad math on steroids formula, how with the trade surplus, with this strong relationship, Australia got hit with a 10% tariff as well?
Senator, Australia has the lowest rate available under the new program. They ban imports of American beef.
Ambassador, excuse me. There is a trade. We already have a free trade agreement. We have a trade surplus. So getting the least bad, why did they get whacked in the first place?
We're addressing the $1.2 trillion deficit, the largest in human history that President Biden left us with. We should be running up the score in Australia.
Ambassador Greer, answer the question on Australia. We have a trade surplus with Australia. We have a free trade agreement. Why? They are a incredibly important national security partner. Why were they whacked with a tariff?
Senator, despite the agreement, they ban our beef, they ban our pork, they're getting ready to impose measures on our digital companies.
With your Greek letter formula, the fact that we have a trade surplus.
We have a global tariff on everywhere. We're trying to address the $1.2 trillion deficit that Biden left us with.
I think that answer, sir, you're a much smarter person than that answer. The idea that we are going to whack friend and foe alike, and particularly friends, with this level is both, I think, insulting the Australians, undermines our national security, and frankly makes us not a good partner going forward. The lack of trust from friends and allies based upon this ridiculous policy that goes into full effect at midnight tonight is extraordinary. I go back to what the market believers believe today is happening. A good day in hospice. I'm afraid if we keep these tariffs in effect, we're looking like an economy that will be in hospice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So you're hearing a fair amount of agreement from the Finance Committee here. First of all, I think there's agreement that we recognize that America's been very generous in opening up our markets. Our trading partners have taken advantage of us. We don't have fair trade. But I think you're also hearing that our constituents rely on trade, and they're going to be harmed by it. So I handed you 10 case studies, and by the way, for the 10 that were willing to go public, probably got another 50 that were concerned if they went public that they may not get the exclusions. Now, I'm somewhat disappointed to hear that exclusions of some of these things are being ruled out at this point in time. They're very specific situations that I think you ought to consider exclusions for, because I don't often agree with the members on the other side of the aisle, but in many cases here today, particularly when they're expressing concern about small businesses in their states, I'm hoping you're and I hope you and the President are very sensitive about companies potentially going bankrupt by these actions. Again, we want fair trade, but I hope you recognize, tariffs are double-edged sword. I would argue a somewhat blunt instrument. A question I have for you: there's no doubt that we have offshored some very crucial products, pharmaceuticals, high-end semiconductors, rare earth minerals. Do you have a list of what those products are that we must, in some way, shape, or form, reshore?
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciate the communication we've had, and I've received your letters, and we'll take a close look at those to make sure we're incorporating feedback as we develop the policy. You'll note in the action we took last week, there were certain sectors that we excluded from the tariff action because we think they need their own investigation and consideration, whether it comes to tariffs or other actions. This includes semiconductors, it includes pharmaceuticals like you're talking about, certain metals like copper, and also critical minerals. These are areas where we have to reshore. We need to be able to think about the best way to incentivize this. There are things we can do as the executive branch, and there are things that Congress can do, and especially with the tax bill coming up. I think these are the kinds of things where we need to create the right incentives.
So you're not using tariffs with pharmaceuticals and semiconductors or rare earth minerals?
So right now they're not subject to a tariff.
Because you want them brought in here because you know they're crucial. There are other products that are also crucial that you are applying tariffs to.
So we are doing investigations right now, and we're considering, with respect to pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, the president's been very clear about this. He said it several times, because tariffs are a tool that can be used to create incentives. What we can't have is the status quo. The status quo has not worked.
Do you believe a trade deficit is just per se always bad?
I think the situation, what we have, Senator, is a large and persistent trade deficit. In normal economic structures and normal markets, you would have a deficit one year that's, or a surplus one year. But what we have is a structural, persistent and growing deficit.
And as a result, offshore some crucial
Yes,
products.
That's a big part of it. Yes,
but
sir.
Do you want to onshore, for example, very high labor content products when, by the way, we're pretty low unemployment rate. I mean, when I went to college, 5% was full employment. We're at 4.2. I've been in manufacturing since late 70s. You couldn't hire enough people in manufacturing back then. Situations even got worse. So I would argue that I'm far more concerned about our budget deficit of $2 trillion. And I realize the trade deficit, we have problems with that. But I think a bigger problem is we don't have enough workers. So are you factoring that into your calculation in terms of what you're actually trying to accomplish here? I mean, all for bringing back these crucial products so that we don't have national security issues with the things that we can't manufacture. But again, I don't want to bring back high labor content. Now I want to diversify our supply chain. It's bad to have that all in China, as we saw certainly with PPE, but a diversified supply chain around the world, because I think trade is a win-win situation. It should be. What are your comments on that?
So I think when it comes to workers, so first of all, we have about 2 million discouraged workers, right? And these are folks who should come off the sidelines for sure. I think the factories that are being built and will be built in the United States will leverage both automation and workers, right? I don't think we're going to have lots of, it's not the kind of labor that's done in some of these other countries. I think our folks are innovative, and the newest factories use a lot of automation, but also workers and people who make the products that the industrial robots that contribute to that automation. But I mean, I think we need to be in a situation where we have production here, right? We need to think not just in terms of quarterly earnings, but in the next century, and how do we set up the American economy now? How do we deal with the emergency now to make sure we can produce far into the future?
Again, I would ask that these case studies be entered in the record, and I just really ask you and the President focus on the products we actually need, as opposed to using this broad instrument. There's going to be an awful lot of collateral damage. People are already feeling that pain, so I hope you're sensitive to that.
Back in the 90s, I was in management consulting, and there was a new platform that came out that promised to transform the business industry, ERP. Some of the early attempts at implementing the system proposed an a la prima approach. Let's do it all at once. Let's change the plumbing out. Let's get it all in, get it done, rip the Band-Aid off. It proved to be hugely unsuccessful. There were a lot of very visible projects, and the industry decided there needed to be a methodical sort of prioritization of what parts of the business needed to perform better sooner, and how do you layer onto that a comprehensive strategy. It looks like we've got a novel approach here in terms of an a la prima approach. I'm not a trade expert, and I'm not going to question it at this point. I do have a question about, at the end of the day, the other thing in management consulting we like to focus on is this concept of one throat to choke. In other words, when you're finally taking a look at a strategy, someone has to own it, and you can't say that it's the president or the vice president. So my first question to you, in this scenario, the decision maker who decided the a la prima approach, who has obviously had to have spent time anticipating what we saw in the markets and some of the pushback. I'm assuming this all got gamed out because it's a novel approach. It needed to be thought out. Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong?
Well, Senator, you can certainly always talk to me, but
But are you at the tip of the spear?
Well, I'm at the tip of the spear for certainly.
Did you propose the alla prima approach?
So, first of all, I would push back, Senator, just a little bit on this. For now, we've excluded pharmaceuticals and semiconductors to take a different kind of approach.
So let's make it
and we've excluded
question.
USMCA.
Section 232 and 301, we know particularly Section 232 is still on aluminum. Section 301 is Chinese imports, where there's no other provider. I overheard you say that maybe, or I thought I heard you say in response to another question, that for the near term there won't be any exclusions. Is that true of China, where they have said the U.S. is unilaterally bullying and completely groundless and they're going to fight to the end? Are the 232 and 301 tariffs exclusions on the shelves until we get to a reasonable agreement with China? I'm just trying to answer a question that I have several people in North Carolina asking.
So the president, again, is the final decision maker on all of these things, and he has directed that there not be exclusions or
There
exemptions.
will not be any exclusions on steel, aluminum, or any products that are only manufactured in China for the foreseeable future until China determines what the end is, because they said they're going to fight to the end. Again, I'm just trying to communicate questions that I've asked, so there will be no exclusions. Yes. I won't waste your time asking for them. That's the main reason I wanted to ask the question. So again, I'm just trying to get my head around the logic of an alla prima approach, and I'm waiting to be, I'm waiting to see it be successful. But it just seems like we've decided to begin a trade war on all fronts, and that's okay if the person who thought this through has an answer for why you go after partners that we have a very long storied relationship with. Maybe we give some developing countries a break because we're trying to actually get their economies functioning, make them look to the West versus to Chinese investment. So it just seems like, I'm getting my head around the alla prima approach. I'm not condemning it because I'm not a trade expert, but I still, at some point, and I understand that you are the trade rep, so if you own this decision, then I'll look to you to figure out if we're going to be successful. If you don't own the decision, I'm just trying to figure out whose throat I get to choke if it's wrong, and who I put up on a platform and thank them for the novel approach that was successful if they're right. But here's what I'm really worried. I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm just going to tell you, every time we talk about people having patience, we need to understand that the Founding Fathers made damn sure that that patience was never more than about 14 months, really. Everything that we need to do to know what the political environment is going to be about next year, it's going to be done by February of next year. So in your mind, do you believe that over the course of the next 14 months, we're going to have a level of certainty, and the people in the trailer park that I grew up in who are going to bear the brunt of some of these short-term cost increases, maybe some job displacement for a period of time, how are they going to be feeling Groundhog Day 2027 or 2026? Do we feel like the majority of this will be resolved and I'll be able to thank whoever thought that the alla prima approach was a good idea? Because that's about the timeline we've got to work with.
Well, Senator, these people who voted for the president, is the same situation I grew up in, you know that.
I agree, but let me just finish here because I don't want to get in the way of my colleagues. Yes. I'll be 65 in August. Every day, 11,400 people celebrate their 65th birthday. That's 4 million a year. So let's say from 60 to 65, people are looking at their 401k statements. They did vote for President Trump. They voted for me. I hope that they will again in both cases. Well, maybe not the president, but I intend to run for re-election. I'm just trying to figure out if they're going to feel good about this, because a long-term play in American politics and a long-term play in American policy, public policy formation, is about 12 months from the beginning of an administration. I wish you well, but I am skeptical. Thank you.
What should a multinational retailer do about their products made only overseas or that contain parts only made overseas? We're seeing this in our automotive sector in Georgia. Should they just raise their prices on families to account for the new tax, or is there a process for that company to reach out to the White House for an exclusion?
So Senator Warnock, the Section 232 on autos is a Commerce Department action. One thing they've done is they have said that they would be willing to give some kind of a credit for U.S. content in parts and components, and they can approach the Commerce Department about this. It's not a decision I'm making, but I know that this is one alternative. I'm mindful, when I hear this, obviously we're sensitive to these dynamics, but it just reminds me that we lost 5 million manufacturing jobs over the last 20 years, and that's part of the reason why we're in this situation now, and we just have to bring those back. So it's important to bring them back now before the situation gets worse.
But the question is, what do they do? Do they pass that price on to consumers?
Well, what we've seen is Ford and GM, for example, have announced actually that they're giving discounts. That was the big news last Thursday. They'd be giving discounts going forward. These companies often are going to figure out how they allocate costs among themselves, and it rarely gets down to the consumer in one-for-one basis.
So the company might figure it out, I think,
well, they can approach the Commerce Department to talk about the credits.
Let me go smaller. Last week, my office met with Angela Hawkins. She's the founder of Bamboo, a small business in Atlanta that sells bamboo-based sleepwear and sheets, particularly for people with severe and sensitive skin allergies like her husband. Angela's products are made overseas because you can't really find bamboo fabric made in the United States. What should Angela do? Pay the new tax, raise her prices, and risk losing customers? Or is there a process for her to apply for an exclusion from the Trump White House?
So, Senator, the president has said that in connection with this action, he's not going to have exclusions or exemptions beyond what's in the program already for certain products.
So she'll just have to figure it out.
She'll have to work with her business partners and find about sourcing, and
she'll have to either raise prices and risk customers. Basically, is the answer, right? Because she can't get bamboo here.
It will depend on the tariff rate. Every country has a different rate, and some are much lower than others, and so they're
she might even go out of business. Let's go even smaller. Early estimates show that President Trump's tariffs will increase the cost of goods by $3,800 for an average American household. Many critical baby goods like cribs and baby gates are produced abroad or made or have foreign-made components. I went through this not long ago as a parent of young children. For an expecting family in Augusta, Georgia, who may now see a 50% price increase for that stroller or car seat, what is the process for that family to apply for a White House exclusion? I guess if the business owner can't get one, they can't get one either, correct?
So there's not an exclusion process. That's right.
So they would just bear the cost.
Well, I think the studies you're talking about, the economists, they got it wrong in Trump 1. They said there was going to be inflation because of tariffs, and it went down. So when I hear them now saying the same thing, I just don't trust what they're saying. And that's, the fact of history shows that it's not a one-to-one. The highest inflation we ever saw was under Biden for housing and education and healthcare and all of these things. And it was, and I don't know where everybody was then when that was skyrocketing by 20%.
What if their child is potassium deficient and now bananas are more expensive? Last I checked, we don't have the climate to grow bananas in the United States. Who should that family reach out to the White House for an exclusion for that price hike on those bananas?
Well, again, as we've discussed, there's not an exclusion process. I think we've waited too long with the status quo. I know people want the status quo. They want the trading system that Wall Street likes, but we can't have it anymore.
So here you and I agree. Nobody wants the status quo. This economy is not working for working families, for ordinary people. And I would submit that what the President did last week in such a reckless and sudden way is adding even more pressure on these families.
So, Ambassador Greer, we've heard a lot of conflicting statements about whether these tariffs are here to stay, how many more rounds of on-off we're going to do. So let me ask the question from a different perspective. Ambassador Greer, we lost 700,000 jobs each month in the last recession. If 700,000 Americans lose their jobs, will the Trump administration suspend these tariffs?
Senator, I think the economists who are making these projections, who often are in favor of fully unfettered free trade, are the same ones who said in the first Trump term that putting tariffs
Greer,
is something that's going to happen,
let me just
Senator.
stop you there. I'm not asking about projections. I'm asking if the numbers show that 700,000 people have lost their jobs because of these new tariffs that Trump has slapped on. Will the administration reverse course and lift those tariffs?
Senator, that's not going to happen. We've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs over the years, which is the number I'm most worried about, and we have to get those jobs
back. So I take that as a no. Let me try another one. Moody's says that if the Trump tariffs remain in place, we will definitely plunge into a recession, which will ultimately cost 3.5 million Americans their jobs. So, Ambassador Greer, if Trump's tariffs push 3.5 million people out of work, will the Trump administration reverse course and lift those tariffs?
Senator, the Wall Street analysts are wrong. They never want to have any kind of change to the status quo.
Right or wrong.
But that's who you're quoting to me, Senator.
I'm giving you a number. If the number is 3.5 million, if it never comes to pass, you don't have to worry about your answer. But if 3.5 million people lose their jobs because of these tariffs, is the Trump administration prepared to lift them?
Right now, this minute, we're working on negotiations with countries who believe they can achieve reciprocity with us and get their trade deficit down. And that's the emergency we're focused on. There's not going to be a situation where years from now we've lost millions of jobs.
Let me try one more time. If Trump tariffs push workers out of their jobs and raise prices, as Fed Chair Powell has predicted, will you reverse course then?
I think also with respect to Chairman Powell, who I don't know personally, but I know the president makes decisions on trade, and he rarely takes advice from Chairman Powell on this. We found in Trump 1 that you could put tariffs on China and you could make it work and have lower income, lower unemployment, lower inflation, and increase real median household income over time as we reshore. And that's what we have to do, Senator.
What I'm hearing you say is that no one can hear a rhyme or reason to why the tariffs are off again, on again, off again, on again. But what you're telling us is the fact that hundreds of thousands, even millions of people could lose their jobs and that prices could go up will not be a factor for you or for Donald Trump for rolling those tariffs back. Look, if Republicans are serious about protecting American jobs and fighting inflation, then they can join Democrats right now to pass a resolution to fix Trump's reckless tariffs. This economy is teetering on the edge of collapse. We have the power right here in the Senate and over in the House of Representatives to take this authority away from Donald Trump. We can get this voted on. Senator Wyden and I have already are about to introduce the bill to do that. And if Republicans are serious about not playing the red light, green light with tariffs, but instead about protecting our economy, our families, our jobs, and keeping prices low, then Republicans should join us on that.
You know, there's a place for tariffs on China. Targeted tariffs make some sense. What is being rolled out and the way this is being done is so destructive and so reckless and so irresponsible that it's creating nothing but economic chaos, uncertainty, and suffering for a lot of people. These are really disastrous for Vermont. I just want to go through this question of how do these roll out? You did not set, as our trade representative, the tariff rates on all of these countries that were on display when the president announced them, right?
Senator, the president made a decision on how he wanted to have the tariff set. And the economic cabinet advised him on that.
Right, but you did not set like the 50% rate on Lesotho.
I personally didn't, no.
Yeah, can you explain how that makes any sense?
So the way that the methodology works is the emergency we're talking about is premised on the trade deficit, which we think is well, I'm trying to explain the methodology, Senator, if you want to hear it.
This has got to get concrete, because this has real impacts on everyday people. So the rhetoric about what the goals are when the rollout is so in conflict with achieving anything other than economic downturn, how did the 50% rate on Lesotho be decided?
So when you have White House economists who assess the trade deficit.
But you had no role in it?
Well, I certainly had a role in it. Everyone was advising the president on how to do this.
Tell me why I came up with 50% for Lesotho.
Well, I'd like to tell you, Senator. So So when you look at a country's trade deficit, we believe that captures some of the unfairnesses, and you have to have a uniform methodology. You can't be arbitrary or capricious.
I'm going to keep going because Lesotho does diamonds, and
I'm happy to talk more to you about the methodology.
There is, I mean, my sense is there is no methodology. I asked ChatGPT, and basically they came up with some formula.
Well, that's not true.
Well, here's how it looks. Donald Trump just got fed up and said, what the heck, we'll just go with this formula that makes no sense. Number two, the issue of these tariffs. Now, the phone is ringing off the hook at the White House from countries wanting to get a break, right?
They want to talk about how to have reciprocal trade with us and how to get that deficit down.
That's right. So here's the structural issue that is really alarming to me, and I hope to all of us. We are using these tariffs, or the president is using these tariffs, from going from an economy that's based on competition to one that's based on access. You know, in a competitive economy, your product, your service determines the outcome and how well you do. In an access economy, it's who's got Donald Trump's number, who's got your number, who's got Lutnick's number, and you call up and you get a break. That's an access economy. Is this going to be the arbitrary authority of the president to decide, yes, we'll cut the Vietnam tariff, and no, we'll sustain the tariff on Lesotho?
The way this works, Senator, is we have longstanding relationships with trade officials in these foreign countries, and they work with our staff, our career staff, and they develop, if someone comes to us with an offer, we review it, we analyze it, and we present it to the president.
They're calling the president. I mean, you've got Donald Trump as president basically picking and choosing winners and losers, and who knows on what basis. That's not a trade regime that anybody can count on. That's something they can game if they know you, they know Lutnick, they know Donald Trump. You know, that I think was what Senator Warnock was asking about. We've got farmers on the border with Canada. They get their grain. It's going to be 25% hit. We've got consumers whose electricity bills are going up because of retaliation from Canada. Can they make a call to you, to Howard Lutnick, to the president, and ask for relief?
Well, we certainly talk to all kinds of constituents. We talk to labor unions, we talk to civil society, we talk to business. I would say with Canada and Mexico, they receive duty-free treatment for things that follow the rules of USMCA. If they bring in Chinese content and send it down, they won't get a break.
Let me tell you the frustration I have. There is a place for targeted tariffs to help us and also to push back on unfair trade practices. I support that. That's not what this is. This is utter chaos, arbitrary and willful on the part of the president that is setting up a dynamic where he picks winners and losers rather than companies compete to do the best they can and have the benefit of good work and a good product.
President Trump said, Mr. Greer, that he had no choice in terms of Canada. And I live 50 miles away from the Canadian border. He had no choice but to bypass Congress and to impose an emergency 25% tariff on Canada to stop, quote, the massive, end quote, amount of fentanyl and, quote, the millions and millions of undocumented immigrants coming from the northern border. Unfortunately, that's a lie. The truth is that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported just 43 pounds of fentanyl was seized at the Canadian border last year, representing just 0.2% of the total. Now, we could agree that 1 pound of fentanyl is too much. But if 0.2% constitutes an emergency, my guess is illegal drugs are coming in from every country in the world. And that gives the President of the United States incredible power to determine tariffs. Further, he said he talked about millions and millions of undocumented immigrants coming from Canada. In fact, last year there were 24,000 people, not millions and millions. First question, really, we can argue about tariffs, but why does the president have to lie all of the time in order to make his point?
So, Senator, I would just refute that when the president is talking about the nature of the emergency we have. I mean,
can you talk a little bit closer into the mic, please?
Certainly. Senator, I would just say, I think you need to look at what the president issued in terms of the order for the legal basis for what we're doing, right? I mean, the president very rightly hit on this issue of fentanyl migration coming from northern and southern borders, and it's a real emergency.
Drugs are a real emergency. 0.2%, you can then argue illegal drugs come from every country in the world. If you declare that as an emergency, you're giving the President of the United States unbelievable power. Let me go on that point. Let me mention to you what you probably know. 7 Republicans have joined a number of Democrats on legislation reasserting Congress's ability to play an active role in trade and tariffs. That, on the Republican side, was led by Senator Grassley. And he said, and I quote, "For too long, Congress has delegated its clear authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce to the executive branch, et cetera, et cetera." He wants to reassert Congress's constitutional role and ensure Congress has a voice in trade policy, end of quote. In the last 2 weeks, all we have seen is reports in the newspaper. Congress has not had 1 ounce of authority in determining tariff policy. Do you think Congress should be completely left out of the process? Or does the President have emergency power to do anything he wants with regard to tariffs?
Senator, my staff has had over 200 meetings with congressional offices in the past 2 months to consult. The President's been very transparent about what he wants to do on tariffs. Congress delegated a lot to him to take this action.
Mr. Greer, you can have all the meetings you want. You and I had a nice meeting. But at the end of the day, the President did exactly what he wanted to do without any discussion, formal discussion with members of Congress. He could make recommendations to Congress, that's for sure. Do you really think that he has the power under an emergency degree to reorder the trade world, global trade policy, without any input from the United States Congress?
Sir, Congress gave him this law where if he determines a national emergency, he can take appropriate action to regulate imports. That's what he's done.
And you think it's a national emergency that 0.2% of fentanyl coming from Canada constitutes a national emergency?
Sir,
do you?
The President has determined that Canada...
I'm asking you.
You're asking me about drug policy. So I agree with the President. If you have China and Canada and Mexico putting drugs into this country at different levels, then that's an emergency. We have to deal with it.
Look, we're not going to argue about the danger of drugs. 43 pounds of fentanyl. On that basis, the President can declare an emergency with any country on earth and take unlimited power. That's called authoritarianism. Okay? That's not what a democracy does. Do you have any concerns about all of that power going into the hands of the President?
Sir, Congress delegated this power to the President. He has to renew the emergency every year. He has to give reports to Congress. Congress told him what he has to do to use this authority, and he's doing those things.
When will those hurting now see real relief?
Senator, the country decisively voted for this President and his trade policy. He knows how to use tariffs appropriately to negotiate deals where necessary and to drive investment and manufacturing back to the U.S. And that's what we're doing. He was successful in his first term in using it. Real wages went up, and that's what we're doing now. And we're working around the clock to make sure we can do that.
Mr. Greer, I gave you a chance to respond to the question, and what you said wasn't accurate. Nobody disputes that the President won the election up here on the dais. But nobody was told in the election campaign that we would have all of these people hurting now because of a flawed trade policy. Once in a while, it said, well, maybe take a little time. But there wasn't any mention of people from one end of the country to another feeling they've been wiped out financially. Nobody heard about that. That was never discussed. Hope you'll have an answer for me, because that's what Americans want to know who are hurting now. They've listened to all of this trade lingo tossed around, and then they scratch their head and say, who's going to stand up for me now? Well, I'll tell you, we're going to fight for those people. That's why I'm proposing a bipartisan resolution that would overturn what's going on with 180 countries. We'll keep the record open for a few days, but what I'd like to know is what the timetable is for helping people who are hurting right now, because I haven't heard anything on that point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.